John Mallett, the Chief of Operations at Bell's Brewing, and Andrea Stanley from Valley Malt join me this week to discuss beer and malt. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 135. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 135, and it's October 2016. John Mallett, the Director of Operations at Bell's Brewing, and Andrea Stanley from Valley Malt join me this week to talk about malt. A quick reminder to subscribe to my newsletter, which now has over 63,000 subscribers. Join by entering your email address and name in the right sidebar at beersmith.com, and I'll send you an article on homebrewing every single week, and no spam. Thank you to this week's sponsor, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They're running an amazing deal right now, only $19.99 for a year-long subscription, or $17.99 for the digital edition. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers, and I've started writing a question and answer column for them on brewing. Take advantage of their special deal at beerandbrewing.com. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com. And also Anvil, a new line of affordable brewing equipment from Blickman Engineering. This week we're highlighting Anvil's Ferment in the Kettle kit that converts your Anvil kettle into a fermenter. Comes with a silicone lid seal for a perfect fit, and you can use your Anvil dip tube as a sediment-free racking cane. Ferment and brew in a single kettle with Anvil. Learn more about Anvil at anvilbrewing.com. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome back John Mallett, who's Director of Operations at Bell's Brewery, and also the author of the book Malt, a Practical Guide from Brewers Publications. He is joined by Andrea Stanley, who last appeared way back in episode number 59, which I think, Andrea, we figured out that was about 3 years ago, right?
Yeah, 3 years ago.
Andrea runs a small malt house called Valley Malt in Hadley, Massachusetts, and it is great to have you guys both back on the show, John. Good to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It's really nice. And
of course, Andrea.
Yeah, nice thanks for having me. Good excuse to get away from putting kids to bed on a Sunday night.
Yeah, and I understand you got out of doing the dishes as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, good deal. Well, John and I just got back from the Craft Beer and Brewing Retreat in beautiful Winter Park, Colorado. But I had no idea the two of you were working together until I sat down and talked to John. So let's start with John. John, how did you start working with Andrea, small maltster and the big brewer?
Yeah, so, as I started researching the malt book, I got a chance to talk to a lot of really fascinating people. And one of my favorite people who came out of that experience was Andrea. She is a fellow malt nerd. We're both pretty passionate about history and malting, and just a great relationship began where we're talking about a lot of interesting historical goofy things.
So, Andrea, can you tell us a little bit about the history of malting? Because I think it's a little more varied than most people think.
It is. Actually, it's in a lot of ways really similar to the history of brewing in that it started as a way for people to have a source of nutrition thousands and thousands of years ago when nomadic people started to become agrarian and decided to cultivate wild cereal grains like barley. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways that they were able to process this was by malting it and using it to make beer. And from there, it kind of took on a role of a domestic person. So generally, the women would be at home in their communities making malt and making beer. And from there, it was more of a cottage industry, small family-run businesses, and actually a lot of times part of breweries. They would also have their own malt houses. And then more recently, in the last several hundred years or so, the industry has become pretty consolidated, like a lot of industries. And recently, with the onset of craft malting, because as a direct relationship to the success of craft brewing, people have now started to bring craft malting back to a local level, like my husband and I, who run Valley Malt.
So, I mean, for a period of time after Prohibition, really all the small malt houses kind of disappeared, right?
They did. There were a few small family-run businesses after Prohibition, and certainly part of breweries. But that, and then along with in the late 1800s, trusts starting to form and consolidation starting to happen. I think that really is where we are today, with a lot of large companies doing a lot of the malting in our country, in North America.
Mm-hmm.
But Prohibition definitely.
John, I'm sorry, you had some thoughts, yeah?
Oh, yeah. I mean, as recently as probably 10 years ago, there were 5 malting companies in the United States, active in the United States. So pretty concentrated. And now we're seeing a real resurgence of small malt houses that are opening up and playing with some pretty interesting ingredients.
And Andrea, I think you had something more to say. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that definitely Prohibition affected the industry quite a bit.
Yeah, definitely cut it back, huh? So, John, you literally wrote the book on malting that most of us read now. Do you have any thoughts on malt history?
Well, I mean, as Andrea kind of summed up, it starts out as, people kind of around a fire trying to make grains so you could chew them. And for much of the history, malting has been done at a very small scale. In Germany today, the diploma that you get is diploma in malting and brewing. So these are really linked exercises, and for the most part, the maltings was happening at the brewery. And of course, that has really changed, with industrialization. These facilities get larger and larger, more efficient, higher level of control. But yeah.
So, I mean, did that happen around 1700s or so when we started seeing, Coke come in, for example, and went away from wood malting and stuff like that? Is that when things started to really consolidate?
Yeah, I mean, the English maltsters, if you look at the English history, you'll see that a lot of those malt houses were quite small, like, the size to have one person work for the day. Sort of literally a one-person operation. And as the rise of the brewers in the 1700s, the malting facilities got larger. Certainly the age of industrialization, mechanical work is replacing human labor. 1880s or so, you start to see some larger organizations and operations. I mean, at one point it's, an intensely physical operation where there's a lot of shoveling, my grandfather used to call it the idiot stick. It had a shovel blade on one end, and well, you get the picture.
To your point, though, Brad, there is I would say the invention or the being able to use coke or anthracite coal definitely, I think, was an innovation in malting. The interesting thing about malting is, in the last however many thousand years, 10,000, 8,000 years that people have been malting, the process really hasn't changed all that much. You use water, you use air, and you use fire, and you use a grain, and you're able to make malt. And it's really not the process that has changed all that much. It's more the sort of the politics and the business side of it, I would say. But one major innovation definitely would have been people being able to start to use indirect heat and certainly cleaner fuels like coke. And and then in the mid 1800s, somebody had another major innovation in malting was when Galland, a Belgian guy, developed a way to be able to force air through the malt to allow it to germinate, to give it the air it needs to be able to sprout. And up until then, it had to be laid on the floor, pretty shallow depth, and it was just using ambient air to be able to have what it needed to germinate. And so now that innovation, and then several years later, this guy named Saladin created turners to be able to turn the malt rather than have somebody raking it all day long. I would say those two innovations definitely are pretty major in the history of malting, and probably changed how the size and scope of malt houses.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the laying out floor malt versus in a Saladin box, and you're really talking about a 10-fold increase in depth, which means a 10-fold decrease in the area that's required. And that's a pretty huge thing. Of course, we should really mention that, drum malting, of course, the Bobby drums developed in England were also pretty important, to increase the throughput, the efficiency, and the consistency of some of the malts that were being made.
Awesome. Well, Andrea, you mentioned the resurgence in small-scale malting. Now, 3 years ago, I think, when we talked to you, you were the only small Maltster east of the Mississippi. I think that's changed quite a bit in the last couple of years, right?
It has changed quite a bit, actually. Since then, there's so I'm part of a Craft Maltsters Guild, and we've seen our membership grow quite a bit over the last 3 years. We have 44 regular members, which means these are folks that are actually producing malt to sell to breweries and distilleries. And we also have another almost 120 who are aspiring maltsters. So, and when I was just looking the other day, we have almost 11 malt houses up and running in Michigan, where John is from. And the state of New York also has a concentration of about 11 craft malt houses. So it's growing pretty quickly, and I would say is, kind of a new phenomenon in craft beer.
Now, are they popping up on the West Coast as well? Do you know?
Yeah, there's 3 in Oregon. There's soon to be 1 in California, North Dakota, Idaho. We're seeing some large-scale barley growers starting malt houses.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, John, one of the keys in this small-scale malting is the use of local barley varieties. And if I recall, only a very small number of barley varieties were grown here in the United States, for the last 50 years or so. But we're starting to see quite a few new ones, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at sort of barley variety, which has a lot to do with the way that malt comes out, it's sort of, I liken it to a breed of dog. If you have a breed of dog that wants to grow to a certain size, and the genetic diversity of the barley that is being grown for malting or the development track for these varieties has been pretty small. And really what we're seeing is an interest in exploring the range of barley flavor or malt flavor that you can get. And by doing that, by focusing on the variety, I think this is a pretty interesting development. As a brewer, I know that I want to have control over my mash, and therefore some critical aspects of the malt analysis are heavily influenced by the variety. So it's really cool to see some of these varieties that are either quite old or perhaps bred out of stock that is a little bit different than where the especially large brewers were interested in pushing it, to see some of these flavors come out with.
So from a brewer's perspective, John, what makes some of these malts truly different than what you might get from one of the big maltsters?
Well, I think that what makes it different is that the ability to experiment on a fairly small scale with different grain varieties and to get a product. I also think that the treatment in the malt house, the techniques that are used in the malt house, really lend themselves to pushing them in some interesting ways. Andrea has given me some malt in the past that very interesting stuff, like sort of a sour rye malt. And that's something that you're just not going to see produced in large batches. And so therefore there's a differentiation there.
Yeah, we were talking about, I think, smoked oats 3 years ago. We had you on, Andrea, right?
Yeah.
You guys do some unique stuff that you really have a hard time getting perhaps from some of the larger ones, right?
Yeah, and it's a lot of experimentation, and in that experimentation, really cooperating with the grower and the brewer to really tailor what we're making to what their needs are.
Now, Andrea, you source most of your barley locally as well. What has your experience been working with local growers and working with their products?
Luckily, my experience has been extremely positive. It's the relationships that I have with growers and with brewers that really make my job so enjoyable. I would say that over the years, we've, been able to develop relationships over 6 years. And so as you see those relationships grow, trust is established, and then you're able to talk to a grower about trying a new variety, or, how they might be growing that barley, and maybe some of the fertilizers that they're using, or the amendments, if we want to play around with protein content and that sort of thing. Those conversations can happen over texting or phone calls, or when we're visiting each other. And I would say it's both positive for them and for us, just because we're all really passionate about what we do. And so I think we all want to make a product that we feel really proud about. And when we can work together to do that, I think it feels even better.
Now, are you starting to see new varieties enter the market as well?
Definitely. There's North American varieties that, especially winter varieties, that seem to be doing really well in New England. And now it sounds like even in Michigan, they're trying out some winter varieties. Some of those were actually bred at through the USDA in Aberdeen, Idaho. And then others we're actually seeing German breeding companies and some other European breeding companies interested in relationships with brewers and craft maltsters and farmers in the U.S. in certain regions, and trying to bring their genetic material, their varieties over here to see if it'll work well. So there's a lot of variety trials going on right now, and some of them are coordinated so that you might have a group of 20 different spring barley varieties, and they're being grown in 20 different locations throughout North America. And that data is being aggregated and collected and reported on, so we can have kind of a sense of how these varieties adapt in what regions they might do best in.
Cool. Yeah, at Bell's, we've been growing barley for quite a few years. We've got a farm up in the center part of the state, and as I look at the way that program has run, finding the right barley variety that grows in our specific locale was important. So we're looking for not just the end results of having the beer taste certain ways, but also what's going to grow adequately in our area. In Michigan maybe has a little bit more moisture during the summer than certainly the high plains of Idaho. And so therefore the barley variety needs to adapt as well. Be kind of like trying to grow a husky with a thick coat down in Miami. That dog might not want to do so well. So anyways.
Well, John, I was lucky enough to brew with you at the brewing retreat in Colorado just a couple of weeks ago, and the image that comes to my mind is watching the mad scientist from Back to the Future work. You're huge on sensory sampling and getting down and tasting and smelling the ingredients. How does this relate to your experiences with malt?
Yeah, I think that, for me, the organoleptic, the sensory component, is probably the single largest factor in as I think about formulating a beer. We can take a look at all the analytical, data that you like, but in the end, it's going to be the beer that the beer is going to reflect the taste of the malt. And I think to get that holistic sense, you really want to put the ingredients up to your mouth or your nose and really get a sense of it. And by the way, it's not just the ingredients that you want to do that too.
Yeah. Yeah, I see Andrea got her beer too, right, Andrea? There it is. Yeah. She texted her husband a minute ago to get some beer. I appreciate that. So Andrea, I've noticed that sensory analysis is starting to play a larger role in malting as well. I've seen some of the big maltsters, for example, are finally starting to show like spider charts on their malts and detailed sensory analysis on their malts. How's that impacted you as a small grower?
Well, I can say that something really exciting that's happened in the last 6 months is that the American Society for Brewing Chemists has developed a hot steep method. So this is a method that's specifically for malt sensory. So up until now, there really hasn't been a validated method for malt sensory. So you had some maltsters that, and brewers that probably chewed a lot of their malt to understand the flavor and aroma, but that method has certainly some flaws. And through the work of craft brewers and maltsters like Lindsay Barr at New Belgium and Cassie Liscombe at Breeze, and a whole slew of other people that helped to create this method, there's now a really simple method for making a hot steep, so kind of like a hot tea, something that's not quite as sweet as wort or what comes off of a Congress mash. And I actually have a few of them going back here.
So is can you walk us through the process if I wanted to try this at home, maybe? Is it something I could do at home?
Yeah, totally. Could totally do it at home with a budget of, maybe $25. You need some thermoses, you need some glassware, filters, and a kettle to be able to get water up to a certain temperature. But you basically get water up to 65°C. You take 400 grams of that water, you mix it with 50 grams of milled malt sample, put it in the thermos, shake it for 20 seconds, let it sit for 15 minutes, shake it again for 20 seconds, and then pour it through the filter. And the wort that comes out is a really great medium to be able to start to become acquainted with the aroma and the flavor and the mouthfeel and the color that you're getting from your different malts.
So do you just use a coffee filter? Is that what you're using, for example?
Yeah, you use a coffee filter. So if anybody belongs to the ASBC, you'll be able to get that method online. It's probably online by now.
Cool.
But so it takes about, maybe a half an hour, by preparing it and getting it going. And then you're able to, have a lot of fun. You could sit down and you can compare different types of Pilsners from all around the world. Here in-house at Valley Malt, we do a lot of comparisons of just our own different malts, for understanding our brands, understanding what our brewers want in their Pilsners or their Pales, and understanding variety. So we're able to really hone in on different flavors that are coming from different varieties. So actually, it's kind of cool in the background here.
Yeah, I see.
All four of these are actually Pilsners, but this one right here, you can tell, is a lot darker. And that's a historic variety of barley. That was all four of these were malted in the same bin. So malted exactly the same way, but that one is a major outlier because the variety is about, a couple hundred years old.
So is that, what kind of variety is that, I guess?
It's called Hannah. It's a two-row spring variety from the Austria area.
So what's the protein on it? Looks like it has fairly...
It looks pretty dark to me.
I'm sure, I haven't had it tested yet, but I'm pretty sure that part of what's driving that color and flavor certainly is the protein content. And also the older varieties are much thinner, the kernel size. And so you have a lot more husk, you have a lot more of the, layers of underneath the husk that create a lot of the enzymes that will, be responsible for Maillard products. So, and amino acids as well. So I don't know. It's pretty exciting.
Pretty dark for a Pilsner, it looks like.
I know.
Yeah.
It's shocking.
Well, you would think that, if you were playing with that malt, you could modify some of the malting conditions to drive that color in some different ways as well, Andrea. Would you?
Yeah, I only have a couple 100 pounds of it because I've been growing this out over 5 years. And you start with like 50 little kernels and then you make your way up 5 years later to like 400 pounds. So I don't know, how much I can experiment with it at this point. But yes, you could under modify the barley. Certainly we malted this in the summertime. It's harder to control germination temperature in the summertime. So I'm sure there are some things we could do but then again, it's an older variety. And I think the uses of it, probably you're not trying to fit a square peg in a round hole with it. I think a brewer might look at this and want to just use it and express it for what it has to offer. it was pretty surprising when this is the second time that I've done a wort with it, and it's pretty surprising how dark it is.
Very cool. Well, John, have you tried this new method of sensory? I know we were chewing grains a couple weeks ago, but have you tried making the tea here?
Yeah, we have in our lab at the brewery. We've got a pretty good size flavor panel there, and we're starting to play with it again. This method is brand new. As we get grains into the brewery, they come onto the flavor panel, and we're assessing them by chewing them, just like we're drinking water that's coming into the brewery or drinking beer that is in process. So this technique is out there, and we're starting to play with it.
Awesome. Well, now, John, Bell's is obviously a very big operation. As a brewer, what kind of advantages do you get from engaging with local small maltsters?
I like engaging with maltsters of all sizes. We've got great relationships out there, and certainly the maltsters are hungry for the dialogue. If you talk to them about what some of the problems or issues that you have or ways you would love to see the malt moved, that's entirely possible. On the small scale, you can really kind of push the boundaries. You wouldn't want to think about if we screw up this experiment and we've got 100 tons of malt, what are we going to do with it? So playing with it and playing with interesting specialty varieties like what Andrea has been talking about with this Hannah are absolutely in the wheelhouse of where the craft maltsters are able to go.
So, Andrea, have you gotten some use out of talking with John extensively? Value?
I mean, somebody that like John that's been brewing and has understood malt. I think a lot of brewers, we can all learn more about malt. I think it's one of those ingredients that might not be as sexy as hops, but it certainly is important. And there's, a lot that we can always continue to learn from malt. So hanging out with people like John and understanding a bit of the history, but also understanding from a brewer's perspective what they're interested in and what they want to get out of their malts.
So tell me about a few of the things you guys have done together. Can maybe John, can you start?
Is that allowed online or
not? We're not allowed to talk about that. It's all top secret. Is that
one of the things that we did this actually with our families this March was we went down to Colonial Williamsburg for a beer history conference, and John
seems to get a lot of these boondoggles. Why is that?
Well, no, I mean it was really great. I mean the conference had a
good to be John.
Conference had a phenomenal group of speakers there, and Andrea and I trying to figure out how you tell the story of malting and brewing together. Somehow hatched up this plan wherein I was dressed as a woman, specifically one of my ancestors who was arrested for brewing strong beer and selling it for too much back in the colonial days in Massachusetts.
Oh, my.
Yeah, so I don't know. That was kind of a unique experience to, be down there at Colonial Williamsburg dressed in colonial women's garb talking about malting and brewing.
With your mom.
With my mom.
With your mom. Your mom was with you too, huh?
Yeah, my mom was there.
She must have been so proud.
I think she was proud. I think my kids were probably horrified by the fact that I was, traipsing about in Puritan wear.
Interesting. And did it work? I mean, did everybody just love it or what?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the review in the New York Times was pretty good, right?
Yeah. And your kids certainly were interested to see the guy in the dress, I thought. That was pretty fun.
Definitely.
Okay. So can we turn to maybe something you did together with beer, specifically brewing?
Yeah, sure. So
maybe you worked on a beer together?
Yeah, so one of the projects that we were involved with was Andrea was very interested in this type of malt called blown malt, and it's a malting technique that hasn't been used in quite a long time, and it's a precursor to sort of caramel malts. So she was interested in experimenting with this and managed to produce some of this malt. And then at Bell's, we did a little homebrew. This guy Ryan Kramer, who's at our at Bell's, is a fantastic homebrewer. He and I made a batch of this beer that really exemplified this. And we presented it at the National Homebrewers Conference in Grand Rapids a couple of years ago. And to taste these flavors coming through, I just think about this beer originates as barley in a field, and it's stewarded through the malting process, stewarded through the brewing, and finally is presented. And to get that palpable sense of history, like this is a type of malt that hasn't been made in 100 years, and to go back through time, to journey back and actually taste that was just fantastic. So, the relationship of doing that, of having a close relationship with the Maltster to be able to figure this stuff out was just fantastic. And Andrea, did we get just dressed up in costumes at that too?
I don't remember. I don't think so. I think that was pretty straightforward. Oh no, we did. Uh-oh. We were in costume. Totally. You were dressed up like Sam Adams.
Was this in Grand Rapids?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I had because women during the war worked at malt houses. And so there was a kind of these pantaloon pants and this outfit that actually I had a friend make for me for that presentation. That's right. That was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So apparently we're involved with malting, brewing, and dressing up.
And dressing up. I'm starting to pick up a theme here. Yes, I am. Well, Andrea, can you tell us a little bit about blown malt? I've never heard of it before. What is it?
Well, it's also called snapped malt or porter malt. So or brown malt. So kind of all in the same category. And it would have been before coal or coke was used, and a hard wood called ironwood was used to basically the kilning of this malt. You would take the green malt and get the kiln going really, really hot right off the bat. So there was some caramelization happening really quickly because the moisture of the green malt would have still been really high. And
so kind of like a caramel malt, right?
Yep. And there was obviously some smokiness to it because it was still being direct fired with wood being burned. And so it got so hot so fast when the malt was still really moist that it actually would make a snap noise, kind of like if you've ever been with a coffee roaster when they're roasting coffee beans, they wait to hear the crack, and it's kind of moisture coming out of the bean. Well, this was what happens with this malt. So this malt was made a lot in England. It actually was made in the United States also to make porter beer, brown beers.
It's interesting, I think it's really interesting as you read through the historical record that you see at one point, this malt, as it goes on and is blown, it's almost like popcorn, like it kind of pops up a little bit. I mean, it doesn't pop that much, but it becomes less dense. And so therefore, if you sell somebody, malt based on measure, on volume, which is the way malt was sold, you're going to get less product. The second thing is that it's not particularly dark. So when finally there was somebody who figured out that, hey, we can roast malt and get it to a pretty dark color, and they patented that process, and that's where we get black patent malt from. You see that brewers start to switch over because the cost is less, and the beer drinkers notice this and are commenting on it. And, I think it's a really, it gives me this palpable sense of traveling back in time to see, imagine what the drinkers and the brewers and the maltsters are all thinking back then. This is the kind of stuff that I just absolutely lights me up, so exciting and interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Andrea, have you been studying, you're obviously starting to grow historical malts. Have you been studying how some of the older malting processes as well?
Yeah, I would say that some of the processes are in textbooks and even some of the equipment. So the kilns that were used to make brown malt or snapped malt were different than the kilns that would have been used to make regular pale malt. So if somebody like us really wanted to start a reemergence of making some of these historical grains, there definitely would be some capital investment in there in trying to rebuild some of the old infrastructure, like the kilns. But yeah, there's a lot, there is a lot out there in terms of the historical information. There's was a malt house in Philadelphia that was run by the Perot family, and there's a lot of information there in the Philadelphia Historical Society of how they made their malt, who they sold it to, the price that they paid for barley. Not a lot of information on the varieties, though, which is kind of interesting.
But you think that, like variety development doesn't occur, at one point it's all landrace varieties. There's the idea that the barley is going to be homogeneous. It's all going to be one breed. Instead, it's kind of like wild dogs just, running around out there. And the idea that you could pure breed something doesn't show up until, roughly the time of Harry Harland and really targeted breeding programs.
So when would that be then?
Harlan was... Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say the early 1900s.
So about the same time we probably started cultivating actual single yeast strains then, right? Would have been the time that we maybe started cultivating single strains of malt or barley, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think about, brewing prior to that age of industrialization was really different. Small, very small scale, not a lot of control. It's really the art and mystery at that point. And as science starts getting injected into it, we have a lot more control.
So, John, have you been able to use many of these small specialty malts in your new beer offerings, or even some of the small beer offerings that you do?
Well, we play with some stuff. So, as I mentioned before, we grow barley in Michigan, and we were very interested in seeing if there was a terroir associated with it. We definitely get a flavor that's distinct, unique, and associated with this barley. So we grow probably about 120 acres every year right now, and for the past years, and use these in certain beers that exemplify that.
Andrea, have you been able to work with other breweries to develop some beers together?
Yeah, I would say more what we're developing with brewers are the varieties that they want specifically for whatever purpose it is. So the malt sensory method that I was we were just talking about, we've been either having brewers come to us or going to their breweries and tasting these different malts together and getting feedback from them about what they like in terms of some of the levers that we can pull here at the malt house in terms of kilning temperature or level of modification. And it's fascinating because every brewery that I go to has a different interest in what they want out of their malt. And even within some of those breweries, the kind of Pilsner that they're going to want for their regular IPA that they're using it for is going to be different than what they're looking for beers that they're putting in their barrel aging. And so to hear that from the brewer's mouth and get that kind of feedback and understand, get in their head a little bit and understand what it is that they're after and believe that we can, by working together, we could actually achieve that is really exciting, and I would say, is happening. With most of our customers, they're really excited about this.
I think about some beer styles. Like I'm going to throw 3 beer styles out that I think are heavily influenced by grain, and so if I was looking to make a wild beer, like I want to make sure that I've got enough long-term fermentables in there to sustain, the full spectrum of microbiology that is going to be there. So, I might be looking for something that's got a fair amount of protein that can hang out, as it goes through successive microbial, attack, if that were the word to use, on something like a lambic. You contrast that with if I want to make a very pale beer, just this, beautiful crystal, beer that stays clean and clear for a long time at a low color. I want to see low protein there. And then lastly, I think that, you sort of think about, interesting styles that are coming up. So like this whole, New England style, very cloudy IPAs. Some brewers are achieving this by doing things like throwing flour in the kettle. And for me as a brewer, this is true, And for me as a brewer, I think this is, it's unstable. And the breweries that are doing this are the way that they're selling the beer is that it's very, very fresh. But is there an alternate way? To be able to get that level of haze that signifies to the beer lover that this is the style. So I think that there's incredible possibilities. Possibilities that didn't need to be thought about when the spectrum of beer in this country was light to really, really light.
Yeah.
I mean, I think my sense of what's going on is, you had craft beer come in and disrupt brewing, and now you have craft malt coming in a way, and I don't mean disrupt in a negative way. I mean disrupt like it shakes things around a little bit and gets people thinking differently.
Well, John, playing off that, I think we're starting to see other ingredients grown locally. For example, I'm hearing that hops are once again being grown in central New York State, which at one time actually dominated the hop production in the U.S. Have you been working with small hop growers as well?
Yeah, absolutely. The Pacific Northwest, so Washington State grows about 70% of the hops in the country. Oregon and Idaho have been the other two places where hops have been commercially grown, and now we're starting to see hops grown all over the country. I'm proud to say that in Michigan, we're actually number 4 right now. So there's about 1,200 acres under cultivation right now for hops. And, one of those facilities is pretty close to the brewery. It's about 8 miles away. And, working with these local ingredients has been just awesome, that we can pull local grains and local hops. And, is there a local terroir, One of the varieties of barley that I think is really interesting that goes back a long way and would have gone extinct except for the U.S. government maintains a germplasm repository in Aberdeen, Idaho, where Andrea had mentioned before, and there they hold on to these old grains. So there's a variety there called Spartan. And I thought, this is the Michigan State. It was bred at Michigan State. And I thought this would be a really interesting grain to grow. We grew some, a few years back at Bell's at our farm and found that, it really wasn't doing that much for us. But I do love the fact that you can reach back into time and really get a sense of perhaps what those beers were then, were made like back then.
So, Andrea, you're doing a bunch of R&D experimentation too with varieties, right? You mentioned you've been growing even some up from nothing, right? From a handful of seeds.
Examples like Hannah, another 2 varieties that we've chosen to actually take the seed and replicate it are Champion of Vermont and a Champion of Vermont and Hannah put together is a variety called Hannah Chamont. And those 3 over the last 5 years that we've been growing out dozens of different varieties seem to be the ones that have risen to the top in terms of them not getting diseases and the yields being pretty decent. So those are the 3 that we're growing out. And the hope is that in the next few years, we'll be able to malt them more commercially and that there will be brewers and distillers that are interested in expressing those in different beers and distillates. But in addition to that, a lot of the work actually now, luckily, is going on at the university level. And really, these are the pros. I'm just in my back garden here planting seed, but honestly, I'm not qualified to be doing anything other than that. So there are a lot of universities in the Northeast. Michigan State University is one of those up in John's part of the world. that are growing out varieties of not just barley, but other brewing grains like wheat and rye, and trying to determine the varieties that are not only going to pay well for the farmer and do so over, a period of time. So not just do well in 1 year, but do yet well, 5 years in a row where the growing conditions are varied. And also varieties that the brewers are going to want to use. So it's happening, and it's happening not just with barley. And then we're able to take those. Actually, right here next to me, I have laid out like 12 different varieties of wheat that were grown in small plots at Cornell this year. And so we're going to micro malt these and do malt sensory, and then get together with some of our brewers that are interested in wheat malt and figure out which ones that they might like. We'll also be getting together with the people that are the breeders at Cornell so that they can start developing a sense of what the flavors are that are coming, what the characteristics are that are coming from these different wheats. So yeah, that's one aspect of R&D, is definitely the varieties. And then I would say, as a malt house, the only other, real R&D is kind of historical processes, and historical varieties are kind of what we like to do.
Yeah, because there's tremendous amount you can get from the process itself, right?
Yeah. So one of the things John mentioned is I have an interest in naturally acidulated malts. So if you read old textbooks, it would have been called brew malt, but you basically take green malt, and before you kiln it, you let it go anaerobic, and
basically sour, right?
Yeah, it gets sour, and so that's something you could play around with forever. And actually, the guys at Bell's, I think when I was there last time, had offered if I wanted to send them some of it, they'd put it under the microscope and figure out exactly what was going on there.
So John, where do you see all this craft malting going from a brewer's perspective? Where do you think it's going to go in the future?
I think that the craft malting movement brings a level of innovation that is very exciting for brewers. In the end, we're going to get very different flavors of beer, and we're going to be playing with a much wider range of genetic diversity in barley. And I think that's particularly important with the possibilities of climate change and changing weather patterns. I'm very up on this.
And Andrea, from your perspective, where do you see the craft malting going?
Well, I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think it's following in the footsteps of craft brewing, in that it is bringing, with each new craft malt house that I'm lucky to be familiar with that's opening, it's because they're small, so much of the business reflects the personality and the background and the skill set of the people that are getting into it. So you have people getting into it that have experience doing barley breeding. You have people starting malt houses that are engineers and are really interested in innovating equipment yet again. You have people getting into it that are farmers, who are brewers, who are distillers. And so each person brings their own unique ideas, and I think that's, like John said, you're going to have this whole spectrum that really wasn't there before, or hasn't been for a while.
So, Andrea, I wanted to give you a moment here at the end to just plug any of the new things you have going on at Valley Malting.
Sure. Well, I would say that one of the more exciting things I'm able to be a part of through the Craft Maltsters Guild and a new craft food and beverage center at Hartwick College is an event called Farmer Brewer Winter Weekend. And it's a pretty amazing weekend. It's 2 days, a lot of technical discussions about malting. We bring speakers in from all around the world. We have a speaker coming in this year and speaking about floor malting, barley breeders coming in and talking about different characteristics of barley varieties. And a lot of the attendees are aspiring maltsters, current maltsters, brewers. I think we've got John and Tim Matthews from Oscar Blues coming this year.
Is John going to dress up in drag again, or no?
Yeah, probably.
It's going to be cold. It's going to be cold out, so there might be fur trim or something
fur trim,
like this.
Yeah.
No.
A nice shawl. But it's a nice cross-pollination of all of, beer is an agricultural product. And so the weekend is a really nice cross-pollination of farmers, brewers, and maltsters, and certainly home brewers that are really interested in digging in and learning more. So that's February 4th and 5th in Oneonta, New York, Farmer Brewer Winter Weekend.
And what's the website if folks want to sign up? I think it's not sold out, right? You still got a few slots left, yeah?
Yeah. You might have to just Google Hartwick College Farmer Brewer Winter Weekend. It's through their website.
Well, if you send me the link, I'll put it in the show notes. How about that?
Great. Yeah.
That sound good?
Yeah.
And John, I want to give you a minute to plug anything you got new that's going on at Bell's or events coming up.
Yeah, I mean, we keep plugging away at making interesting, different beers. Probably I saw earlier you'd thrown up the graphic for Oatsmobile, which is one of the beers that we've put out into larger distribution. It's a beer we've been making for a while. And, this beer has been at our downtown pub for quite some time, and we're finally moving this over to wider distribution. And, for me, the story of this beer goes back to a trip I took over to England and was doing some collaborative brewing there, and discovered some interesting ingredients to play with, and brought that into the program, developed a beer, some new American hops, and we just got such great reception about it that finally, Oatsmobile has kind of stepped up and taken it to the big league. And for me, the heart of this beer is about malted oats, a grain that is not usually thought of as being a malted product, but when that comes through, you just get this delicious, as I love eating ingredients, as you've noted, and for me, when I eat those ingredients with this, it just tastes like the most healthy breakfast you could ever imagine. Yeah,
you taught us a cool trick in Colorado too, right? Using a little whiskey.
Oh yeah. So brewer's breakfast, yeah. So if you're ever brewing and you've got this delicious sweet wort that you're collecting, no hops in it yet, taking that and putting a little bit of Irish whiskey in there can be quite nice. You don't need much, but it's just a great flavor.
I was really shocked how well it came out, especially when it's cold outside. So throw a little whiskey in your wort and put it in a glass. It's fantastic.
Yeah, you only need like an ounce or two total liquid. I mean, you're talking about a fraction of a lot, but boy, what a great flavor combination. So brewer's breakfast, highly recommended.
Well, I wanted to get your closing thoughts. John, would you like to go first, perhaps?
It's a great time to be a brewer. It's a wonderful time to play with malt.
Okay, Andrea.
I mean, I guess I'm always just kind of shocked sometimes that brewers like Bell's even know what craft malt is and are interested in it. That's kind of shocking to me, but I obviously appreciate all the brewers that are interested in learning more about their malt and that see the potential in craft maltsters, and that we actually do have something to offer, even though most of us at this point, even being in the business for 6 years, I would still consider myself an amateur. So to give amateurs even a second thought, I think is pretty awesome. So would be my closing thought.
Yeah, I would imagine your production is a tiny portion probably of what John brews in a year, right, John?
Yeah, but I think that this is you want to be out there. You want to be have your finger on the pulse, and for me, as they say, malt is the soul of beer, and so why wouldn't you have your finger on that pulse?
Good. Yeah, good closing point. Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank you both for being on the show. Really appreciate you being here. John, first, thank you again.
Thanks so much. When you said you were interested in having me on, what an honor. It's, great to talk to you and thanks.
Well, I certainly hope to have you on again soon. I'd love to have you both on again soon, talk some more about this. Andrea, thank you again for being on the show. Really appreciate it. Let's not wait 3 years. We'll get you on sooner next time.
Anytime. Thanks, Brad.
So again, my guests today were John Mallett, Director of Operations for Bell's Brewery, And also Andrea Stanley, who runs Valley Malt in Hadley, Massachusetts. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brad.
Well, a big thank you to John Mallett and Andrea Stanley for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. This month features hoppy and mixed fermentation lagers. Take advantage of their fantastic sale and get a 1-year subscription now for only $19.99 from beerandbrewing.com. And also Anvil, an amazing line of affordable brewing equipment from Blickman Engineering. Get their Ferment in a Kettle kit that lets your Anvil kettle be used as a fermenter. You can see the full line of Anvil equipment at anvilbrewing.com. Again, that's anvilbrewing.com. And finally, a reminder to join the BeerSmith newsletter. Enter your email address and name in the right sidebar at beersmith.com, and you'll get a high-quality article on homebrewing sent to you every single week. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.